What happens when Hollywood's most uncompromising voice walks into a late-night studio expecting professional conversation and instead encounters a host determined to mock his past for viral clicks? What you're about to witness isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is the explosive story of how Jimmy Kimmel tried to humiliate Clint Eastwood with a decade-old controversy and instead triggered a monologue so devastating, so unflinchingly honest, that it fractured his entire audience, broke his show's rhythm, and created a moment that would dominate headlines for weeks. This is the interview where careful preparation met unscripted truth and lost. This is the confrontation where Hollywood polish collided with raw authenticity and shattered. This is the moment when millions watched a living legend demonstrate that some men refuse to be anyone's punchline, regardless of ratings or viral potential. And this is the night Jimmy Kimmel discovered that inviting Clint Eastwood onto your show means accepting whatever truth he decides to deliver, whether you're ready for it or not. The green room backstage at Jimmy Kimmel Live carried an unusual chill that evening. Not the artificial cold of overactive air conditioning, but something else, something harder to identify. A tension thick as smoke before wildfire, hovering in the air like a warning nobody wanted to acknowledge. Clint Eastwood sat isolated in a steel-backed chair, the kind of aggressively modern furniture designed by people who'd never understood comfort. His weathered hands that had gripped revolvers in 100 westerns, directed Oscar-winning films, built careers and legacies, held a single sheet of paper. White, crisp, trembling slightly under the pressure of his grip. 5 lines typed in clean studio font. Topics to avoid. Politics. The 2012 RNC speech. Gun control debates. Civil rights protests. Voting history. His thumb traced the final item slowly, pressing against it with the care of someone testing a blade's sharpness. Behind him, Maggie, his longtime manager, the woman who'd navigated him through 5 presidencies, 2 marriages, and Hollywood's endless cycles of reinvention, stood with arms crossed, spine rigid as iron. Her eyes tracked the young producer in the headset who'd ventured too close with a nervous smile and clipboard clutched like a shield. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd learned to read storms before they arrived. "Don't attempt clever," she said, each word precisely placed. "Don't cue manufactured laughter. Don't chase viral moments. If you corner this man, he won't perform for your cameras. And no script in this building will repair what breaks." The producer blinked, attempted a laugh that died in his throat when he met her eyes, nodded rapidly, and retreated behind the curtain, like a child backing away from something dangerous he didn't fully understand. Maggie turned back to Clint, who remained motionless, still studying that paper like it contained prophecy or threat. His eyes weren't angry yet, not quite, but something in his jaw, that slow grinding tension she'd learned to recognize over decades, made her deeply uneasy. From somewhere down the hallway came the thump of the house band rehearsing, the bass line carrying like distant thunder, echoing off concrete and plaster, and the bones of the building itself. Maggie checked her watch. 7 minutes until showtime. Clint folded the note with meticulous precision, each crease perfectly aligned, then slipped it into his blazer's inner pocket. He didn't look at Maggie when he finally spoke. "They're planning something." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact delivered with the certainty of someone who'd learned to recognize ambushes decades ago. "Yes," Maggie confirmed simply. "They are." Clint nodded once. That was all the acknowledgement needed. Across the hallway, through a partially open door, 2 producers argued in hushed tones that carried just far enough to be overheard. The older one wore a suit despite being backstage polished, experienced, the kind of executive who'd survived multiple regime changes. The younger one dressed in calculated chaos hoodie, expensive sneakers, hairstyled to look unstudied. "We need something significant," the young one insisted, practically bouncing with nervous energy. "He's been memed before. Reference the chair incident. It's perfect material. Just a 30-second throwback. Trust me, it'll explode online." The older producer hesitated, uncertainty flickering across his face. "It's dangerous territory. He's unpredictable." "That's precisely what makes it work," the younger one grinned, already imagining trending hashtags. Back in the green room, Clint rose with slow deliberation, his movement carrying the weight of someone preparing for confrontation rather than casual conversation. Maggie handed him a small paper cup of black coffee. He accepted it, took a single sip, then placed it untouched on the side table. She watched him adjust his collar, pull the blazer snug across his shoulders, that note still tucked over his heart like a warning label only he could read. The stage manager appeared at the door, clipboard in hand, face tight with forced cheerfulness. 2 minutes, Mr. Eastwood. You're up immediately after the monologue. Clint offered no reply. He simply walked past the stage manager without acknowledgement, boots echoing softly against tile as he moved toward the stage entrance. Maggie followed a half-step behind. As they approached the curtain, Jimmy's opening monologue bled through something about celebrity scandals, delivered with practiced timing that generated programmed laughter from the audience. Clint stopped. His eyes narrowed. His head tilted slightly toward the sound, and he stood absolutely motionless for 10 full seconds. Maggie recognized the stance immediately. The pause before thunder. The breath before the gun clears the holster. Behind them, the hallway emptied as staff gave them unconscious distance. Everyone knew who he was, but more importantly, they understood what he represented when provoked a force that couldn't be controlled by studio lights or commercial breaks. Maggie leaned close, voice dropping to a whisper. Just discuss the film. If they provoke you, don't strike first. Clint looked at her, and for just a moment, the faintest trace of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Then it vanished as completely, as if it had never existed. The stage manager raised his hand, counting down silently with fingers. 3, 2, 1. The curtain began rising. The band kicked into a brassy riff. Jimmy's voice echoed over the cheers. Ladies and gentlemen, the legend himself. And Clint Eastwood stepped forward into the light. The studio swelled with manufactured energy lights blazing. Audience applause washing over the set like programmed waves. Jimmy Kimmel worked the crowd with practiced ease, riding that familiar rhythm of charm and perfectly timed pauses that had defined his career. Clint settled into the guest chair under the harsh studio lights with characteristic calm. Not relaxed, there was nothing soft about his posture, but controlled, present, alert. Like a man who'd walked into a poker game already smelling the marked cards. Jimmy launched into his familiar pattern, voice dancing between reverence and casual intimacy. It's genuinely an honor having you here. You've got a new film releasing. Tell us what drew you back to the director's chair. I never left, Clint replied simply. The audience chuckled, uncertain whether it was meant as humor. Jimmy grinned, nodding as if he'd anticipated the response, leaning forward with rehearsed interest. The film centers on a rancher, correct? A man defending his property from corporate takeover? Clint offered a minimal nod. It's about standing your ground. Jimmy latched onto the phrase immediately. A metaphor for something larger? No, Clint said flatly. Just the ground. Another ripple of laughter, lighter this time. Jimmy smiled, but the edges carried tension. He pivoted smoothly, changing angles. This rancher character, is he anything like you? Clint shrugged slightly. He minds his own business until someone provides a reason not to. That line landed with weight. The crowd hummed with it, responding to something authentic beneath the words. Watching from the wings, Maggie exhaled slowly through her nose. She'd heard this in preparation, knew it was coming, but it still affected her. Jimmy tapped his pen against the desk. There's a line in the trailer. Something about freedom not being free. Clint said nothing, just watched. You've always embraced that kind of language, Jimmy continued, voice carrying subtle challenge. Freedom, justice, the lone gunslinger standing against corruption. But I'm curious, how do you view those themes now? With everything happening in the country these days? There it was. Clint's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the armrest. A pause stretched between them, elastic and dangerous. The audience stilled, instinctively sensing the atmospheric shift. Freedom, Clint said carefully, isn't about what you carry. It's about understanding when you don't need to. Jimmy blinked, processing. So you mean? I mean, guns aren't freedom, Clint continued, his voice steady and precise. The ability to not reach for one, that's the part nobody wants to discuss. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Someone clapped. Someone else hissed disapproval. The room was already beginning to fracture. Jimmy raised his eyebrows, shifting in his seat, trying to reclaim momentum. Let's switch direction for a moment. You've been in this business for decades. Started with television westerns, made your name with Dirty Harry. Did you ever imagine back then you'd still be creating films at your age? Clint looked at him steadily, not smiling, not irritated, just looking. Did you ever imagine you'd still be asking questions designed to avoid the point? The crowd tensed. It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but it cut deep, exposing something beneath the surface pleasantries. Jimmy laughed too quickly. All right, I suppose I walked into that one. He leaned back, regrouping, picking up a cue card from the desk and scanning it like a lifeline. Clint didn't look away. His posture hadn't shifted a fraction. Watching from backstage, Maggie tilted her head, eyes narrowing. She could feel the tremor in the air, the host attempting to maintain control, the guest refusing to grant it. Jimmy cleared his throat. I read somewhere that you still ride horses every morning. Is that accurate? Sometimes, Clint replied. Still carry a six-shooter? Jimmy added with attempted playfulness. Clint didn't answer immediately. Then, with zero inflection, you watch too many movies. The audience laughed again, but nervously this time, like people watching a tightrope walker suddenly wobble. Jimmy chuckled along with them, but something flickered behind his eyes, irritation perhaps, or dawning realization. All right, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. Just trying to give the fans what they want. Clint looked at the audience, then back at Jimmy. Are you? Jimmy's smile tightened. Hey, we appreciate you being here. We just want to hear the stories, the good ones, the authentic ones. Then stop cutting the edges off them, Clint said simply. The sentence dropped like a stone into still water. Not angry, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Jimmy opened his mouth, then closed it again, searching for his next move. Maggie shook her head gently in the shadows. Not because Clint had said too much, but because she recognized he was just beginning. The laughter had thinned to something brittle, stretched across the studio like glass under increasing pressure. Jimmy shuffled his cue cards with studied casualness, but his fingers drummed the desk at an accelerated rhythm that betrayed his discomfort. Clint remained motionless in his chair, that same unsettling stillness, radiating something deeper than performance, something that carried weight, demanded attention, refused to be managed or controlled. Jimmy tried again, his voice attempting lightness it couldn't quite achieve. So Clint, we've been discussing the new film grit, land, justice, classic American themes. But you know, this isn't the first time you've spoken publicly about the state of things. A few audience members chuckled preemptively, sensing where this was headed. I mean, come on, who could forget that infamous chair speech? Jimmy's grin widened as calculated laughter rippled through the crowd. You remember that one, right? 2012 Republican National Convention. You walked on stage and delivered a speech to, what was it again? An empty chair? The reaction was mixed, some laughter, some groans, tension crackling through the space like static electricity. Let's take a look, shall we? Jimmy gestured toward the monitor. The lights dimmed. The screen flickered to life, displaying that now iconic image. Clint Eastwood standing beside an empty chair, gesturing, improvising, firing off lines about invisible politicians and broken promises. It had been memed, mocked, dissected, debated. For younger audience members, it existed only as a YouTube clip. But for Clint, it was something else entirely, a scar that hadn't healed, a moment weaponized against him repeatedly. When the clip ended and lights brightened again, Jimmy was already leaning into his prepared moment. So tell us, who were you really talking to that night? The president? The voters? Or just a chair? The audience laughed louder now, relieved to have permission, grasping for comfortable mockery. Clint didn't laugh, didn't blink. I was talking to a hole, he said softly. Jimmy blinked. Pardon. Clint leaned forward incrementally, his voice remaining quiet but gaining intensity. I was talking to the hollow space left behind when leadership stops listening. The room hushed. When politics becomes noise instead of action, Clint continued. When men shake hands for cameras and stab backs behind closed doors, that chair wasn't empty by accident. It was empty by design. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some leaned forward, others leaned away, the division becoming physical. Jimmy attempted to steer back toward safer ground. Yeah, but Surely you knew it would stir controversy, right? That it would be, I don't know, misinterpreted? People don't misinterpret silence, Clint replied. They fear it. Because silence forces them to fill in the blanks themselves, to confront what they've been avoiding. The tension in the studio became palpable now, something you could almost reach out and touch. Jimmy glanced toward the production booth, then back at Clint, still trying to wrestle back control. Come on, Clint. That night, a lot of people thought you'd gone off script, that maybe you'd lost the thread. Clint's voice cut through him like a blade made of absolute calm. The thread was already lost. I just pointed to the hole it unraveled from. More murmurs, scattered applause, audible objections, the audience fracturing in real time. Jimmy's grin was fading now, genuine discomfort seeping through his professional mask. Well, I guess we won't be rolling that clip again anytime soon, he forced out a laugh. Clint didn't respond. You know, you're kind of proving the point, Jimmy said, attempting recovery. That we can't even joke about a chair without starting a riot. Maybe it's just television. Maybe it's not that serious. Clint looked out at the audience, scanning the rows slowly before his voice dropped lower. That's the fundamental problem. You think because it's on a screen it's safe. You think the lights make it less real. He turned back to Jimmy. But when people stop expecting anything from the chair, when they stop believing anyone will ever sit in it and actually listen, that's when the country starts to rot from the inside. The crowd stilled completely, not frozen but breathing, feeling, processing something they hadn't expected to encounter on a late-night comedy show. Watching from the wings, Maggie's hands clenched at her sides, jaw set tight. She recognized this was no longer about a film or a clip or a host chasing viral moments. This was a man dragging a symbol back into harsh light and forcing everyone to see the decay beneath the polished surface. Jimmy exhaled sharply. Okay, Clint, you've made your point. Just a chair. No, Clint interrupted firmly. Not just a chair. A mirror. And for several long seconds, Jimmy Kimmel had absolutely nothing to say. The silence following Clint's words wasn't empty. It was loaded, taut as a wire stretched between buildings at dangerous height. In the studio, nothing moved. The band didn't shuffle their instruments. The floor crew barely breathed. Jimmy Kimmel sat a beat longer than comfortable, blinking as if the lights had suddenly intensified. Then, with a small shrug attempting casualness, he leaned forward. All right. So the chair was a mirror. Fair enough. He paused, recalibrating. But since we're already cracking the seal on uncomfortable truths, let's go one more round. He shifted in his seat, forcing something resembling a smile. You talk about leadership, about silence, about people being left out. But let me ask, when the country erupted in protests, when people filled the streets over George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all of it, where were you? The crowd stirred audibly. Backstage, Maggie went rigid. Jimmy continued, his voice steady but carrying a new edge. You believe in freedom, right? In standing your ground. Why not stand with them? Why not say Black Lives Matter? Clint's expression didn't narrow. His mouth didn't twist. He simply looked at Jimmy like a man measuring the weight of a question that had been thrown too carelessly. Freedom, he said evenly, isn't something you rent for a protest. You either own it or you don't. Jimmy opened his mouth, but Clint continued before he could speak. You want to talk about standing up? Good. Let's discuss all the people who marched, who chanted, who raised signs for cameras, and then turned off their conscience the moment the feed ended. A profound hush fell over the studio. The audience was already splitting, some nodding, others shaking their heads, the fault lines becoming visible. Jimmy tried to interject, but Clint's voice cut through, calm but razor sharp. You think freedom has a color? It doesn't. But hypocrisy certainly does. It comes dressed in whatever cause is trending that week, wrapped in slogans, sold in hashtags. The first wave of reaction hit gasps, a few cheers, scattered boos. Then the crowd fractured completely, splintering audibly into opposing camps. Clint didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, eyes burning with steady intensity. I'm not here to perform sainthood for the left, or martyrdom for the right. I've seen too many flags waved by men who never bled for anything real. Jimmy was still smiling, but it had transformed into something brittle, something on the verge of shattering. So what, you don't support protest? I support people who live what they shout, Clint replied. Who show up when the cameras leave. The rest? Noise. More applause mixed with protest. Someone in the back section yelled something indecipherable. A woman near the front rose halfway from her seat, then sat down again, shaking her head. Maggie muttered under her breath. There's no commercial break big enough to clean this up. Jimmy adjusted his collar, clearly unsettled. But don't you think silence sometimes equals complicity? Clint nodded slowly. Sometimes. But shouting empty words is complicity too, just dressed prettier. The air was electric now, the audience a live wire. Clint wasn't raising his voice, but every sentence landed like a weight dropped from height. Jimmy attempted a laugh. You certainly know how to stir a crowd. They're not stirred. Clint corrected quietly. They're waking up. The floor producer was gesturing frantically at the booth, making cutting motions. But the cameras stayed hot. Someone upstairs was watching the numbers, and the numbers were climbing exponentially. Jimmy glanced again toward the crew, then back at Clint. So what would you have done? If not take a knee or hold a sign, what's the right way to stand up? Clint looked past him at the crowd, his voice dropping just slightly. The right way? You live it. You vote like it matters. You work like your name's on the laws. You teach your children to see people, not colors. And you don't wait for a hashtag to care about justice. The room swelled with mixed reaction shouts, applause, murmurs all folding into each other like a rising tide nobody could control. Jimmy shook his head, exhaled hard. You talk like the system's already broken. Clint's response came quiet, not defeated, just true. It was never whole. Maggie closed her eyes briefly. She'd witnessed Clint deliver speeches before, seen him rattle cages and challenge comfortable assumptions. But this wasn't performance or show business. This was a man carving open the room with truth like a scalpel, and no one present was safe from the exposure. The room was shaking now, not from physical motion, but from the weight of words that couldn't be taken back, truths that couldn't be unspoken. Jimmy sat partially turned toward the crowd, as if trying to gauge whether they remained with him or against him, whether this was salvageable or spiraling into something no producer could contain. His fingers tapped the desk once, then again. No rhythm, just nervous energy seeking outlet. Clint didn't move. His shoulders remained square, posture like carved stone. He looked not at Jimmy, but directly into the camera, at the red light blinking live, at the millions watching from homes across the country. That chair, he said quietly, voice carrying absolute certainty, wasn't for a president. It was for the people nobody discusses, once the confetti's swept up and the slogans rot in the Sunday. The crowd stunned. Seconds earlier now reacted in waves. A woman near the front stood abruptly, hand over her mouth. Applause broke out, scattered at first, then louder, but not unified. Just as many were booing, some shouting him down, others shouting support. The air cracked with division. No cue cards could navigate this. Watching from the wing, Maggie stood pale-faced, jaw clenched. She saw Jimmy glance desperately toward the control booth, this time clearly seeking rescue. Clint continued, voice calm but steel-wired underneath. You want to know who I was talking to that night at the convention? I was talking to ghosts. 1 million ghosts. Americans who vanished from the political conversation because they didn't fit the headline. Not loud enough. Not photogenic. Not useful. He leaned in slightly, eyes never leaving the camera lens. And they're still gone. Still unseen. Because both sides would rather scream at each other than sit down and actually listen to the people they're pretending to fight for. The crowd burst again, some on their feet applauding, others pointing fingers, shouting over the noise. The band wasn't playing. The lights hadn't dimmed. There was no commercial break, no edit, no way to soften this moment. Jimmy sat with his hands flat on the desk, lips pressed thin. His show, his name on the building, his territory, and none of it belonged to him anymore. Maggie took one step forward, just enough to be visible to Clint, silently signaling him it was time to leave. But he raised his hand, a simple gesture, not angry, not dramatic, just final. Not yet. Then he stood slowly. The audience fell half silent, like someone had cut the volume but left the static humming. Clint turned. Not to Jimmy, not to Maggie, But back to the camera. Back to that unblinking red eye transmitting everything to the world beyond the studio walls. His voice dropped lower but somehow grew louder, carried more weight. That chair's not empty anymore. The words landed like stones striking steel. The kind of sentence that doesn't require explanation, just echo. He held the moment. Let it settle. Let it sting. Maggie exhaled through her nose. She didn't smile. But something in her eyes, something between pride and heartbreak, revealed she'd known this was coming. She had warned them. Not because Clint was unpredictable, but because he was exact, precise, unwilling to compromise. Behind her, a junior producer fumbled with his tablet, desperately trying to cue a bumper, a commercial, anything. Someone else yelled about advertising windows closing. Nobody was listening. Jimmy finally stood, not to regain control, just because sitting felt wrong in this moment. He looked at Clint, then the fractured audience, then back at the empty chair beside his desk. And for the first time that night, Jimmy Kimmel had nothing to say. Clint nodded once, turned, and walked off stage. The crowd roared, part applause, part protest, all of it absolutely real, completely unscripted, impossible to manufacture or manage. The night air outside the studio carried unexpected cold, the kind that settled beneath skin without asking permission. Clint Eastwood stepped through the side door, the echo of the fractured crowd still rattling through concrete walls behind him. He didn't look back, didn't speak, just walked with measured steps, hands at his sides, each movement deliberate, like a man accustomed to gravel underfoot and silence after fire. Maggie followed close behind, her heels clicking once for each of his 2 strides. She didn't rush, didn't attempt to fill the space with words. He'd spoken enough for one night, maybe for an entire decade. Behind them, studio lights pulsed and flickered. Inside, chaos reigned. Producers shouting into headsets, PR teams drafting damage control statements before the outro music had even started. The next scheduled guest, canceled. The next segment scrapped entirely. Social media was already 10 steps ahead. On Twitter, the clip of Clint walking off stage appeared within 90 seconds. No edits, no filters, just that wide shot of him leaving, the chair empty, the crowd split behind him like a broken tide. By the 5-minute mark, hashtags had materialized. Number Clint was right. Number Eastwood eruption. Number chair no longer empty. The views climbed in real time. Millions by midnight. Cable news split immediately. One conservative anchor called it the most disrespectful moment in live television history, branded Clint a relic, a has-been chasing relevance through theatrics. A left-leaning commentator disagreed, calling it dangerous in a different way. Giving someone like Clint Eastwood an uncensored microphone in 2025 was like handing matches to a dry field. But somewhere in between, on smaller platforms, quieter voices whispered it might have been the most honest 5 minutes on television in 10 years. A moment where someone finally spoke uncomfortable truths and refused to smile afterward. Maggie caught up to Clint as they neared the black SUV waiting at the curb. She didn't touch his arm, just walked beside him. "You always know, don't you?" she said softly. "How to make the room go silent. Not by yelling. Just by telling the truth nobody else will say." He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. Behind them, the banner stretched across the building's side fluttered in a sharp gust. The corner ripped free, a glossy image of Jimmy's face bending back on itself. The word "live" tore straight down the middle, flapping like a wound left open too long. Maggie turned to look. Clint didn't. He paused at the sidewalk's edge, looked up at the night sky where a helicopter pulsed red light against the clouds. Below, the city buzzed on horns, engines, the relentless hum of a country too busy to breathe. Inside, the show limped to a close. Jimmy sat back at his desk, voice flat, attempting to joke his way through closing lines. The laughter from the crowd came delayed, uncertain like muscle memory functioning without conviction. The music played them out, too loud, too bright, a fireworks display at a funeral. But none of it could compete with the image already burned into screens across the country. A man walking away from the spotlight like he'd never needed it, and never would again. Clint opened the SUV door. Maggie slid in beside him. No words exchanged, just the faint creak of leather seats and the solid slam of a door shutting the world's noise out. As the car pulled away, camera phones kept recording, but Clint didn't wave, didn't nod, just stared ahead as studio lights vanished in the rearview mirror. Somewhere behind them, that chair remained on Jimmy's stage. But it wasn't empty anymore. Not really. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point he'd been making all along. That silence speaks when filled with truth. That empty spaces demand to be noticed. That sometimes the most powerful statement isn't what you say, but what you refuse to accept. The country would argue about it for weeks. Cable news would dissect every word. Social media would wage digital wars over who was right and who was wrong. But for Clint Eastwood, driving through the LA night toward home, the message had been delivered exactly as intended. Clear, uncompromising, impossible to ignore. And whether America wanted to hear it or not didn't matter nearly as much as the fact that it needed to be said. The chair was no longer empty. And that truth, uncomfortable, divisive, undeniable, would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling.